And Melbourne has, for millennia, been a meeting point for our First Nations, particularly where we are right now, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri. And the river that we now call the Yarra, as many of you will know, was then the Birrarung. And it was a meeting place because it was rich in vegetation and food sources. And that same river is what made it then appealing to European settlers when we arrived. And one of the first things that Europeans began to do was to change the river, to reshape it, to take out the waterfalls, to widen it. And that enabled shipping and other activities. And so really, the Melbourne, as it is today, the title that the erudite folk at Foreground suggested was, for me, was, I'm never sure, is it Aquapolis or Aquapolis? Anyway, either way, you know, it really shows that Melbourne is fundamentally a city built on water. And so, as I get into what I've been asked to address around affecting change at a city scale, I'm going to talk to the initiative that my work is part of, 100 Resilient Cities, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing in Melbourne. But if you come back to what I was just saying about Melbourne being fundamentally built on water, when you think about it, there are very few cities around the world that aren't. 100 Resilient Cities was created by the American philanthropic organization the Rockefeller Foundation. And they set themselves the challenge as they approached their centenary to say, if we're going to be around for another 100 years, I don't think they were asking the question, I think it was assumed, if we're going to be around for another 100 years, what would be the single greatest benefit that we could deliver to the world? And they drew from their own experiences. Again, for the urban planners in the room, they had sponsored Jane Jacobs' work in the United States back in the 50s. They've been profoundly involved in cleanup after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and Superstorm Sandy happened on their doorstep. And with that experience, but also casting forward, they said, in the face of ongoing urbanization, continuing or deepening globalization, with the interplay with climate change, if they could help cities be better able to deal with all of these things, so that would be their single greatest contribution. In other words, if they could help cities to be more resilient. So they said, well, how many cities would we need to do that to really affect change around the world? And there was a little bit of science in it, and there was quite a lot of art in that they went, well, 100 years, 100 cities, that sounds quite cool. And then we'll chuck in $100 million, and then it's 100, 100, 100, and so that's the 100 Resilient Cities Network was born. So again, actually, between them, Andrew and Matt really did touch on it, but just going back to sort of the concept of how we create, you know, where the work has come from, how we create this change, it really is the interplay between having ever more people living in cities, which means that the consequence of an event of any description will be felt that much more by a greater number of people. And with the globalization piece, what it means is that as we have an event is not felt just in any single city, but it actually has ripples around the world. As we talk about water, the floods in Thailand a few years ago brought the car industry globally to a halt because of the certain parts that were manufactured in Thailand and couldn't be either produced or exported for a period of time. So we are profoundly interconnected, and the idea is then again with climate change happening, the likelihood of extreme events impacting our cities will be that much greater. So the definition, because this concept of resilience is kind of interesting, and I see a few friendly faces in the room. Well, you've all got friendly faces, but some of them I know better than others. And sometimes people say, well, what's the difference between sustainability and resilience? And I think there are a couple of things on that. So, firstly, and one of the things that my easy way of framing it is, in many ways, resilience is sustainability, but acknowledging that things will go profoundly wrong along the way. And the other bit is that it's quite different. So I've been a sustainability practitioner for 20 plus years. And what is different about this is if you say to somebody, what does it mean to be a sustainable person? It's very difficult. What does it actually mean to be a sustainable person? But with resilience, it's something that is innate within us. We profoundly understand it, and I think that has a value in terms of how we begin to engage with communities, citizens, and how we therefore build our cities. So with all of that said, still, what is this concept of resilience that all of these cities are working on? The definition that we all work to, and this has been adopted by the Victorian government as well, is that urban resilience is about the ability of a city, its institutions, organizations, systems, businesses, communities, and individuals, and their ability to adapt, to survive, and to thrive in the face of whatever chronic stresses and acute shocks that they face. And the resilience agenda is really about that interplay. And when you think of water and water in cities, that sort of the chronic stresses and the acute shocks really begin to play out. So I'll just touch on that and talk about 100RC a little bit before talking to Melbourne. So of the 100 cities that are in the 100RC network, about 80 of them say that they have extreme water issues of one kind or another. I actually think that's wrong. I don't quite believe them. I don't know of any city that doesn't have profound water issues in today's world. It's not my place to tell cities that they're wrong, but I would be really surprised that when you dig into it to find that there are any aren't dealing with this. And basically it comes, as many of you will already know, it's either too much, too little, or too much of the wrong kind at the wrong time. And so if you take and that sort of too much of the wrong kind at the wrong time is really thinking about sea level rise, inundation, and so forth. So in New Orleans, one of the big impacts that they've had to deal with following Hurricane Katrina was actually that when the levees broke, what you've seen is a massive rush of saline water, seawater, into what should be fresh water that has killed a lot of the mangroves that should have been there to provide some of the protection against the surge in itself. What New Orleans is now doing is they're talking about 5 lines of defense. So they are rebuilding and managing in a new way some of the outer islands that used to protect the city. They are also then revegetating the mangroves, and they are also saying that while nature is a profound part of the solution, they are also putting in a 150-meter concrete wall to protect it. So it's the interplay between the human-designed and built and the natural. In Los Angeles, for the film buffs who've enjoyed those car chases through the Los Angeles River, that huge bit of concrete, some might say monstrosity, is being completely redesigned under the resilience strategy now, and they're looking to rebuild nature into it for a whole range of reasons. One is that when you build fast concrete channels, water flows through it. The idea was get the water out of the city as fast as possible, but actually that creates all kinds of other risks. The other thing is that it actually evaporates much quicker in an extremely arid place like California. Actually, you want to try to retain the water a little bit better, and so nature is a profoundly good way of doing that. And in Rotterdam, they have really, I had the privilege of spending a bit of time with some of the speakers last night, and someone was making a joke about the Dutch boy with his finger in the dike. But actually, the Dutch have been living with water and managing water for many centuries. And as we go into this new era that Andrew spoke to, of sea level rise and other water challenges, then the Dutch really are. We've got an awful lot to learn from them. So much so that there is now a well-worn joke in New Orleans that 2 hours after every rainstorm, there's a Dutchman selling water services. But it is interesting as we think about it as designers and practitioners, and how do we actually turn the challenges that we have within specific cities into opportunities across a range of things. And I guess that begins to take me into what we're doing in Melbourne. So the final thing I'd say on sort of, as I move to Melbourne pieces, in terms of the too much and too little regarding water, so often they kind of come together. So we had 10 years of drought here in Victoria, and within a year of that drought breaking, we had some of the worst flooding that we'd experienced in the 2010-2011 floods. So it is a profound and uncertain time. So what are we doing in Melbourne? sort of the simple story is that 100 Resilient Cities put out a call for cities who wanted to get involved, and the City of Melbourne applied. And then 100 Resilient Cities came back saying, listen, we'd love to work in Melbourne, you've got some real challenges, but you work well together, and some people seem to think you're quite livable. But if this is about the City of Melbourne, that's just not going to work for us, because that's not how systems and resilience works. So you've got to find a way of coming to us as a metropolitan region, or metropolitan city, and if you can do that, then you're in. Now, I know that a number of you know this, but just quickly, there are 32 councils that make up Melbourne as what is either referred to as Metropolitan or Greater Melbourne. The Premier of Victoria would disagree with me on this. I'm sure he thinks that as a city there is a clear sort of governance structure and that it sits under him. But in terms of how other cities are managed around the world, there is no metropolitan governance system. So the work that we undertook had to be done in ways that was about trying to create things that were sufficiently attractive that people would want to work together to be better prepared for this uncertain future. So to create the strategy that we have, which is represented there, and what that refers to is literally the first time in Melbourne's history that we have had a metropolitan-wide strategy that has been led by local government in partnership with many others, including the state. In going out, I guess one of the things that was sort of we had to do, and there's something to this when you think about design, when you talk about the hubris and other things. We had to go out and be extremely humble. We had to go to these other councils and say, listen, none of this can work if you are not involved. So rather than saying we've got a great idea and you must do it, or we've got a profound threat, we've got to take action, what we actually said was, listen, we've got an intriguing opportunity, but we really need your involvement. So what would we have to do to get you to come along with us? And so as this strategy developed, and the way that it came together, what we ended up with was something that had been worked on by over 1,000 people from 250 different organizations, in which we agreed that resilience in Melbourne would look like one in which our diverse communities were viable, sustainable, livable, and prosperous. And what that means, because in some ways that's just one bunch of buzzwords to describe another buzzword. So what that means in reality is we said, I guess particularly local government were really happy with this idea of working on being sustainable, livable and prosperous, because half of them have those in their kind of council plans and their various strategies anyway. It all sounds like good stuff, so why wouldn't you want it? A few people pushed back on this viable bit. They said, surely, Melbourne's a great city, our viability is not in question. And again, as you think about this and as we sort of go into the day, if you take a look at Melbourne alone, and you could apply this across many cities around the world, but firstly, on this point about the viability, we have pockets of our communities in supposedly the world's most livable city that struggle to be viable on a daily basis, a city in which children go hungry every day, and as was touched on earlier, we are rapidly undermining the natural environment on which we rely. Secondly, you can point to any number of examples over the last 10 years alone where whole communities have very nearly not come back from extreme events. And thirdly, if you're still not getting me, just bear in mind that only 4 decades ago, Detroit, the city in the United States that has recently been poisoning its citizens and filed for bankruptcy, was the second wealthiest city in the United States. So the idea that our prosperity, our viability is somehow locked in is perhaps a little overconfident. Nonetheless, as I say, we haven't been able to sell this on the basis of scaring people. So what are some of the things that we've done? We've had to look at things that seem attractive that will help us to manage these shocks and stresses. And again, that begins to take us into the landscape architecture and the water theme of today. So most people quite like the idea of living in a greener city. So we've actually said, well, we're going to work on creating a metropolitan-wide urban forest. My colleagues Ian Shears from the City of Melbourne and Adrian Gray from Brimbank, you'll be hearing from later, are really at the forefront of doing some of that work. What we're trying to do is connect up their efforts within single municipalities and take that out at a metropolitan scale. But as we think about the shocks and stresses that I spoke to, what's the role of trees and vegetation in that? Well, on the stresses side, we know that one of our stresses is declining health and mental health. And actually, access to nature and open green space, people are much more likely to take active exercise if they have access to green space. Secondly, there is actually a mental health benefit of having access to nature. So it actually directly addresses some of those stresses. But equally, we know that with better vegetation, a better soil quality, we can actually retain water better and use vegetation to retain water, thus reducing flood risk. And one of the things that Melbourne has done really well and been well known for is the effect of using good tree canopy cover to reduce the urban heat island, which, depending on the modelling, suggests that you can reduce the urban heat island effects by 4 to 6 degrees with canopy cover. So that's one of the things, again, and whereas it is also appealing is every council, well, again, this can't all be about local government, but every council plants trees and vegetation anyway, so this is really about how we repurpose existing resources to get better outcomes. Ian may well touch on later on about certainly the work with the City of Melbourne, the interplay between trying to manage through a drought and reducing water usage, but actually then the unanticipated consequence of what that meant for the health of the trees that actually were keeping the city cooler and so forth. So there is a profound interplay with water management. So we've got a specific action on integrated water management, very much the theme of today. And so as we think about, some of some fairly basic things, yes, there are some profound technological things that we can do. Matt referred to I forget actually, but anyway, something engineering and impermeable surfaces and so forth. And actually, if we can just capture water better, we let more water run off every year off our streets and so forth than actually we use. So there are tremendous opportunities in that space. And I think Kong Jan Yu and some of the others will also talk to that, and Luca, who's next up as well, in the context of their cities and work. So I'm going to really sort of wrap up there. I just think there are a couple of sort of things that I guess, cling to in my work, and I hope have some relevance to you. Firstly, there is a reason that we talk about people being born on the wrong side of the tracks. Design is both a reflection of the societies in which we live and also a determinant of social outcomes. And when you think about the social piece and people in cities and so forth, I mean, if cities aren't being built for people, a deep social element, I'm not sure who else wants them. So it has to be, this work has to have really people deeply held at the heart. The other thing that I very, very briefly sort of touched on, but there's increasing and great research about the neurological effects of being exposed to beauty, the endorphins and other responses that the body physically had, and that one of the things that is most intrinsic with us as humans is a response to nature as beauty. So building more nature into our cities is going to be the point. And so my final point for the day, before I let you get on and hearing from a really, really great selection of speakers, is that I really hope that the future is about growing our cities as much as it is about building them. Thank you very much.